October 1942, Station 105, Chelveston Airfield, England. They say wars are decided on the battlefield, but at Chelveston it was decided in a white tent, a surgical tent trembling in the wind like the heartbeat of America pulsing in the heart of England. Inside, Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow, Chief Surgeon of the United States Army Air Forces, leaned over the operating table. Before him lay a young man, not yet 20, a pilot from a B-17 just returned from the skies over Germany. On his flight jacket, tiny shards of metal were embedded deep, like burning fragments of memory. The scalpel touched the steel clamp. The sound of heavy breathing mixed with the roar of engines landing outside. Another plane had made it back, another load of bodies torn apart by German flak. Grow knew these wounds all too well. They were not from fighter gunfire, but from flak. Anti-aircraft shells exploding mid-air, scattering hundreds of steel fragments like a deadly rain. In recent weeks, more than 70% of the injuries he treated were the same: shrapnel through the abdomen, chest, and sometimes even through the soldier's soul. He looked at his hands, the hands of a doctor, not a soldier, and wondered, was there another way? Could they be saved before they ever reached this table? Outside, an ambulance convoy approached. In the damp chill of the English night, the wailing sirens blended with the wind, sounding like the heartbeat of an entire generation. The numbers began piling up on the operating table: 36% dead from chest wounds, 39% from abdominal wounds. Each percentage was a face, each surgery, a prayer, and it was there, in that tent of smoke and lamplight, that a single question sparked. A question that would change the fate of thousands of men in the skies over Europe. If a bullet loses half its force when it hits steel, why don't we carry steel on ourselves? That question became an equation in the mind of a military doctor. Grow knew that flak fragments lost much of their energy after flying a few hundred yards. A thin, lightweight layer of steel might stop them. But the idea of armoring pilots sounded absurd in 1942. No one imagined turning airmen into knights of the modern sky. That night, after the last surgery ended, Grow sat alone at a folding wooden desk. He opened his leather notebook, jotting down every statistic, every pattern of wound, then sketched a few rough lines, the outline of a vest made of small, overlapping squares. In the margin, he wrote, "Steel plates overlapping, light, flexible, protective." The lamplight glowed on the page like a blueprint from the 14th century. But in truth, it marked the beginning of a 20th century revolution. Outside, the fog thickened, and the distant ambulance sirens echoed again. Grow looked up, listening to the wind whipping the tent, and knew time was against him. Each day, dozens of pilots took off without knowing if they would return. Every wound he stitched was a record of failure, the failure of man against physics. Yet within that white tent, amid the sounds of scalpels and the wind, faith in human reason flickered to life again. Grow could not see victory yet, but he could see a chance for a generation to survive. When the October 1942 report reached the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, they read for the first time an unusual proposal. Development of protective body armor for flying personnel. At the bottom of the memorandum, Grow wrote in firm, resolute letters, "We cannot accept these wounds as inevitable." From that moment, in the heart of war, a new front was opened, the front of medicine, of steel, and of the unyielding belief that a human life is worth fighting for just as much as victory itself. In the weeks that followed, the skies over England grew no brighter. Rain and the smoke of war blended into an ashen gray that draped every base along the eastern coast. At Chelveston, Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow's surgical tent still burned light through the night. But this time, he wasn't stitching flesh. He was stitching numbers. From the medical stations of the 8th Air Force, he gathered hundreds of injury reports. Each sheet of paper was a wound, each number a life. Those pages told the same story. Nearly 70% of all casualties came from low-velocity flak fragments, not enemy fighter bullets. Those slow-flying shards didn't rip bodies apart like armor-piercing rounds, but they were cruel in their own way, passing through leather jackets, piercing abdomen and chest, and remaining buried inside bodies like tiny memories of the sky. Gros placed his hand on a map of Europe spread across the table. He looked at the red circles drawn around Rouen, Lille, Bremen, Hamburg, Kiel, the targets of American bombers, and the waiting nests of German guns. Each circle wasn't just an air target. It was a ring of life and death for the men flying inside it. And within those rings, Gros asked himself, how can we lower the death toll without changing tactics? He understood that to win the war, America had to preserve its men, not just its machines. In his personal journal, Gros wrote, "Science has helped us fly higher, faster, and bomb more accurately, but it has not helped us protect the heart of the soldier." The handwriting trembled with cold, but the thought was steady as steel. By November 1942, Gros completed the first casualty analysis of the 8th Air Force. It confirmed what no one had expected. 36% of the wounds were to the chest, 39% to the abdomen. Together, these accounted for 75% of all bomber fatalities. The greatest enemy wasn't German fighters, it was flak, the coldly named Flugabwehrkanone, anti-aircraft artillery. A single 88mm shell could reach altitudes of 30,000 feet. At that height, it exploded, the casing shattering into hundreds of shards, each no larger than a finger, yet deadly hundreds of yards away. They tore through aircraft hulls, and when the aluminum broke apart, those fragments became a second wave of shrapnel, slicing through the narrow fuselage, killing the very men who flew it. Gros examined the bits of metal removed from pilots' bodies, twisted, uneven, some curved, some flat, some as big as a coin, others fine as grains of sand. This was no longer the physics of war, it was the mathematics of death, every angle, every speed, a probability of dying. And as every doctor knows, if something can be measured, it can be reduced. One rainy afternoon, Gros stood on the airfield watching technicians patch a B-17 riddled with holes. New aluminum plates were riveted over the wounds, thin, but when the light hit them, they shimmered with a gentle silver glow. He realized then, if a few millimeters of aluminum could save an airplane, could a few millimeters of steel save a man? That thought followed him back to his tent that night. At his wooden desk, he took out paper and began sketching. An armor vest made of small, overlapping steel plates, like fish scales, sewn into thick fabric. Not the rigid iron of medieval times, but a flexible shell that could move with the body. A brigandine for the 20th century. As he set down his pencil, he thought of the knights of old, men who once believed they could defy death with the technology of their age. The next morning, Gros carried his draft to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force at High Wycombe. He presented it simply. Torso wounds are fatal because the torso is unprotected. Protect the torso. Save the man. But the room fell silent. A few officers frowned. Add 20 pounds of steel to every pilot. They already carry 40 pounds of gear. Who pays the price for that weight? Impossible, another said. We need speed, not armor. Gros didn't argue. He simply placed a small tray of thin steel plates on the table, the kind he believed could stop flak fragments after they'd lost force over 200 yards. It doesn't have to be heavy, he said quietly. It just has to be smart. His voice was low, but heavier than steel. Finally, an old general,
once wounded at the Somme in the First World War, nodded. "All right, try it. A limited experiment. If it doesn't send the pilots falling from the sky, we'll consider it." And so Gros got what he needed, a chance. A chance to turn statistics of death into lives saved. A chance for science not just to soar above the clouds, but to protect the hearts beating beneath flight suits. When he left the meeting room, the English sky was still gray. But this time, through the drizzle, Gros saw light glinting on the surface of steel, shining like hope. He knew where he needed to go to make his sketch real, and he knew that place lay in London, in a forge that had stood since the 18th century, the Wilkinson Sword Company. December 1942, London, England. The city still bore the scars of the Blitz. Many streets were without power, house walls pockmarked by bomb damage, and the fog mixed with coal smoke wrapped all of London in a dark curtain of war. Against that backdrop, a tall, thin American in a medical officer's coat stepped out of a U.S. Army Air Force's Jeep. It was Colonel Malcolm Cummings Gros, carrying a strange idea, an idea he believed could save thousands of lives from the skies over Germany. He arrived at the Wilkinson Sword Company on Chelsea High Street, a place that had forged swords for British officers since the Napoleonic era. Amid the hammer blows and the red glow of the forge, Gros felt as if he were stepping into the past, where steel was forged for warriors, not doctors. But this time, the steel was not meant to kill. It was meant to protect. The work's chief engineer, George Wilkinson, shook his hand and half-joked, half-seriously said, "We're used to forging blades, not sewing garments." Gros smiled. "I'm used to stitching people, not stitching steel. Maybe we should learn from each other." That collaboration began in a small room with a few drawings and some trial pieces of steel. Gros explained in detail to the engineers how flak fragments penetrated the body, velocity, impact angle, and energy loss over distance. He drew an ellipse on the blackboard to represent the torso and pointed, "This is the chest, this is the abdomen. If we protect this area, we save 3 out of 4 lives in the air." The engineers listened intently. They were not used to hearing a doctor speak of physics, but there was something in Gros' voice that inspired belief, a mix of compassion and the cold calculation of science. Day after day, steel was forged, cut, and bent for testing. Gros tried dozens of alloys, carbon steel, nickel steel, and finally settled on manganese steel, a metal hard enough to stop flak fragments, yet ductile enough not to shatter on impact. Small steel plates, each only 2 inches square and 1 millimeter thick, were stitched into heavy canvas, lined with soft cotton to cushion blunt trauma. When assembled, they resembled fish scales, a modern, flexible brigandine that hugged the body. A young engineer asked Gros, "Sir, where did you learn this? Harvard?" Gros shook his head slightly. "No, I learned it from the wounds." The answer silenced the room. They understood this was not merely an engineering project. It was a race against time. In the weeks that followed, prototypes were made and then rejected. Some were too heavy. Some were not pliable enough for pilots to fit into cockpits. Some restricted shoulder movement needed for firing. Gros did not give up. He donned gloves and tried each version himself, bending, twisting, sitting, standing, then laughed. "If I can still raise my arm, they can too." At the end of January 1943, the prototype was finished. The armor came in 3 parts: a main vest covering chest and back, an apron protecting the abdomen and lower torso, and an auxiliary plate for special positions like the ball turret gunner, the gunner beneath the aircraft. Total weight, 22 pounds. A red cord ran along the side. A hard pull would release the entire suit so the pilot could bail out in an emergency. Gros lifted the armor and felt its weight in his hands. 22 pounds,
Not just steel, but 22 pounds of hope. He wrote in the report to command, "If one life is saved by this, that weight is worth more than all the tons of bombs." The first suits were sent to 8th Air Force test crews in England in March 1943. In the initial missions, results came faster than anyone had predicted. When pilots returned, their suits bore deep, distorted steel fragments, stopped just short of the heart. A junior medical officer at Bassingbourn recounted, "We found flak lying on the steel plate. It didn't penetrate. Without it, the wearer would have been dead." The news spread through the bases. From Thorpe Abbotts to Ridgewell, from Kimballton to Polebrook, they affectionately called them flak suits. They were not knightly armor, but the armor of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. However, Wilkinson's sword could not produce enough. The firm could make only 100 suits a month, while the 8th Air Force's need numbered in the thousands. War allowed no waiting. So Grow began a second journey, to find a way to bring production home to America. Leaving London, he paused on Westminster Bridge and looked out at the Thames blurred in the mist. Big Ben stood silently in the distance. He told himself, "If the English could endure the Blitz, we can learn to protect those fighting it." On the train home, Grow opened his notebook and wrote a single line. Next, bring the armor home. Summer 1943, New York, United States. Malcolm Grow returned to an America pulsing within the great machinery of war. Shipyards in Richmond were launching vessels in just 4 days. Ford factories in Michigan had transformed automobile assembly lines into airplane engine production. And in New York, the city of steel, glass, and light, Grow went to a place no one would have imagined, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The grand building on Fifth Avenue was hardly the kind of place one thought of when speaking of weapons. But within its basement, in the arms and armor department, were people who had spent their entire lives studying armor, craftsmen, scholars, and restorers of the Middle Ages. They were not soldiers, not engineers, yet they understood better than anyone how steel protects the human body. Grow met Stephen Grandsay, curator of the ancient arms collection. He placed on the table the armor prototype from Wilkinson's sword in England, layers of thick canvas, 2-inch square steel plates, weighing 22 pounds. Grandsay lifted it, turning it over as light from the window gleamed across the metal. "Brigandine," he murmured. "The principle dates back to the 15th century. Flexible armor made from overlapping plates." Grow nodded. "I need a 20th century version. Lighter, easier to manufacture, and strong enough for one man to survive." In the weeks that followed, the museum became a laboratory of war. Amid glass cases displaying suits of shining medieval armor, Grandsay's craftsmen were cutting, testing, and stitching. They compared old riveted joints with new industrial fabrics. Metals were tested in different alloy compositions. Heavy canvas was replaced by nylon, a new synthetic material developed by DuPont, lighter, stronger, and more resilient. One craftsman told Grow, "When we restore old armor, the key is balance between protection and movement." Grow replied, "So is ours. The only difference is, if they failed, they died in legend. If we fail, they die in reality." By August, the final prototype was ready. It was called the M1 flak vest, nearly 5 pounds lighter than the British model. The outer shell was made of gray-blue nylon, water and oil resistant. Inside were more than 300 manganese steel plates, each 1 millimeter thick, layered precisely and sewn into individual compartments. A soft cotton inner lining absorbed shock on impact. The whole construction hugged the body closely, yet allowed pilots to move freely within their cramped cockpits. And most importantly, it retained the red emergency release cord. One pull, and the entire vest would fall away in seconds, so the wearer could bail out. Grow took the prototype to Wright Field, Ohio, where all new U.S. Air Force equipment was tested. In the testing room, simulated flak fragments were fired from 200 yards into the vest. The sound of metal striking metal echoed, sharp and final. When the smoke cleared, the engineer examined the plate and smiled. No penetration. Grow said nothing, just touched the small dent, the mark where a piece of metal might have passed through a man's heart. On October 5, 1943, the 8th Air Force officially approved the M1 flak vest as standard issue for all bomber crews. In the handwritten order signed by General Ira Eaker, one line read, "All crew members shall be issued body armor appropriate to position." Other models followed quickly. M2, for pilots and co-pilots, lighter with reduced back coverage. M3, for ball turret gunners, shorter and more maneuverable in tight spaces. M4, for waist gunners. M5, for navigators and bombardiers, with additional belly protection. Each type was numbered, weight-balanced, and mass-produced in factories across New York, Boston, and Chicago. Industrial sewing machines that once stitched flight jackets now sewed steel and nylon, humming rhythmically, the heartbeat of a nation fighting with intellect as well as firepower. Within 3 months, the U.S. had produced over 10,000 armor suits, far exceeding every projection. Crates were loaded onto ships crossing the Atlantic to the air bases of England. Along with guns, bombs, and fuel, America now sent one more thing to Europe, the hope of survival. Grow wrote a letter to Wilkinson Sword, thanking them for paving the way. One passage read, "Your swordsmiths have taught us how to forge armor for life instead of death. Thank you for giving medicine a new blade, the blade of compassion." And as young airmen tried on the new vests, heavy, stiff, a little awkward, they still smiled. One joked, "Well, I look like a knight now." Another replied, "Knights didn't fly at 20,000 feet, buddy." Laughter echoed inside the fuselage, blending with the rumble of engines warming for takeoff. No one knew if the next mission would bring them home. But for the first time, they carried something between themselves and death. Not a charm, not a prayer, but science, steel, and faith. Over the skies of England, the spring of 1943 carried a pale light and the dry, cold winds of war. From the long runways of East Anglia, formations of B-17s thundered into the air, their engines beating like the heart of an entire generation. Inside the cramped fuselages, amid the roar of wind and metal, young men wore something strange, an object they simply called the flak suit. When the first ones were issued, many were skeptical. Some bomber pilots complained it was too heavy, that the straps dug into their shoulders and sweat pooled beneath the layers. But only a few weeks later, stories began to spread from base to base. A gunner from the 303rd Bomb Group told how he had felt a heavy blow to his chest during a flak burst and thought he was dead. When they landed, the crew opened his vest, and there it was, a flattened, harmless shard of steel, stopped just a few centimeters from his heart. From the medical stations of the 8th Air Force, reports began to arrive. Among dozens of injuries, most men who wore armor survived. The flak fragments were trapped in the thin steel plates, unable to pierce through. The vests were scorched, dented, twisted, yet beneath them, there was still breath. Military doctors kept the damaged armor as evidence, proof that death had come close, but had been stopped in time. Malcolm Grow read every report. He crossed out the old figures in his notebook and replaced them with new ones. For the first time, the casualty graphs fell. Between March and July 1943, in the test units, fatalities from chest and abdominal wounds dropped by more than 70%. In the notes section, Grow wrote only one line: "Numbers are lives." Back in New York, the factories ran day and night. Nylon fabric, manganese steel, cotton padding, all spun together in the urgent rhythm of an America manufacturing hope. Thousands of M1 and M2 vests were packed into crates labeled Flyers Armor, shipped across the Atlantic to Liverpool, and then distributed to the air bases. These shipments carried not bombs, but the chance of return. By October of that year, no one called Grove's program an experiment anymore. It had become part of the war itself, a new skin for the 8th Air Force. And that same October, history marked one of its bloodiest days, Black Thursday. That foggy morning, more than 290 B-17s took off, bound for Schweinfurt, Germany's largest ball-bearing factory. As they crossed the border, German flak batteries opened fire, a storm of explosions, dense as falling stars. The sky turned into a labyrinth of flame and smoke. Inside a B-17 nicknamed Rosie's Riveters, Navigator Harold Beck felt his chest explode with pain. He fell, convinced he was dying. But minutes later, he was still conscious, still gripping his map, his heart still beating. When they landed, the crew found a steel shard buried deep in his armor plate, unable to go through. Beck only laughed hoarsely. "If it weren't for this thing, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you." But outside, hundreds of others weren't as lucky. 60 bombers never returned. 17 more were destroyed. Over 100 came back riddled with holes. On the runways of East Anglia, crippled aircraft limped home one by one, the smell of smoke and oil mingling with the scent of blood. Grove stood silently, watching the survivors step out. Their vests blackened, plates warped, but their eyes still bright. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Nothing can ease today's grief. But knowing some are alive because of our steel, that is enough for me to go on." The medical report after Schweinfurt went to Air Force Command. Among crews using body armor, fatal chest wounds dropped from 36% to 8%, and abdominal wounds from 39% to 7%. Total casualties fell by 60%. It wasn't just data, it was proof that intellect could alter fate. After that day, no one doubted again. Headquarters issued an order. All bomber crews were to be equipped with M1 flak vests before the spring 1944 campaign. American factories expanded production, and by year's end, more than 50,000 vests were in Europe. At the airfields, a familiar ritual appeared. Young pilots tightening their straps, tapping their steel chests like a good luck charm. They knew the armor couldn't stop every death, but in the chill of the English fog, amid the rumble of engines ready to take off, the feeling of something between them and death, even just a few millimeters of steel, was enough to make them believe. As the B-17 formations disappeared into the clouds, Grove stood by the runway, watching. He understood that armor could not make war less cruel, but it could make men less hopeless. And sometimes, less hopeless was enough to win. Sewing machines across American factories, women stitched thick layers of nylon fabric, sliding into them small square plates of manganese steel. They didn't know the physics behind it, only that each tiny piece of metal would soon rest over the chest of some mother's son flying above the skies of Europe. From the drawings of Malcolm Grove and the team of engineers at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, American factories began full-scale production. The M1 flak vest was continuously improved, lighter, softer, easier to wear. The M2 for pilots and co-pilots, M3 for ball turret gunners, M4 for waist gunners, and M5 for navigators and bombardiers. Each model was the result of hundreds of hours of testing. The work of minds that understood each position in a bomber meant a different way of facing death. In the design room of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, artisans who once restored the armor of knights were now using that same knowledge to protect a new generation. They studied every detail of 15th-century brigandines, learning how to overlap metal for both fit and flexibility. The pencil notes on their sketches, curve at ribs, soft underarm, add release cord, became technical guidelines for the entire program. It was a fusion of art and war, of craftsmen's hands and a doctor's intellect that created one of the most life-saving inventions of World War II. From sewing rooms in New York and Boston, hundreds of crates of armor were loaded onto Liberty ships bound for the Atlantic crossing. Inside each shipment, along with steel and nylon, was a small slip of paper that read, "For someone's son. Handle with care." Across the ocean, the 8th Air Force had changed. Now every crewman suited up in armor before flight. The skeptics no longer laughed. They understood. Those vests were not mere equipment. They were promises from home that they would be protected. The numbers proved it. A medical report from early 1944 recorded that fatal chest and abdominal wounds had dropped by over 80% compared to 1942. Total injuries were down nearly by half. And most importantly, morale had soared. Airmen now believed they had a chance to come home, and that belief